All right, so this morning we are going to continue in chapter 9, starting with verse 11, and we'll be going through chapter 10, verse 11. And as we start chapter 9, verse 11, the preacher is setting the stage, I believe, for what he wants to say about wisdom. This is a fairly long section. We won't get through all of it this morning, but he's got a lot to say about the importance of wisdom. And I believe that he sets the stage by going back to something that he said in the second verse of chapter 9 and amplifying that. So verse 11 says, "Again, I saw that under the sun, the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, nor bread to the wise, nor riches to the intelligent, nor favor to those with knowledge, but time and chance happen to them all." You remember back in verse 2 of chapter 9, he basically said, it doesn't always happen that good things happen to good people. In fact, what he said was that very often in life, we see the exact opposite. We see that good people have many trials and struggles, and often it's a very difficult existence. And then we look at wicked people and we see that they seem to be inordinately blessed of God. And that was one of the things that frustrated him, one of the things that caused him to call this life vain. And now I think he's taking that principle and he's applying it to the various talents that he sees that people have. And he singles out 5 kinds of people, if you will. There are the strong, there are the swift, there are the wise, the intelligent, and the knowledgeable. And I think we might all agree with him in this area that as we look at those qualities of people, these are the people that we would expect to be successful. Oftentimes we see very intelligent, very knowledgeable people doing quite well. Even if it's knowledge of trivia. I was talking to Paula the other day at how successful 4 or 5 people who have excelled at knowing trivia on Jeopardy have made millions of dollars of just being able to quickly recall things that most people wouldn't bother to learn. And then certainly the strong and the swift would relate to many of our athletes who make hundreds of millions of dollars playing sports. And so we would expect these people to do quite well. But what the preacher says is oftentimes that's not the case. These are people who don't do well, who really struggle in life. And what I think he's saying to us is that human ability is no guarantee of success in this life, because disaster can overtake any one of us. And there really is no way for us to predict when that might happen. Now, when it comes to time and chance, we have to be a little careful with how the preacher uses it here, because he's not using it in the way that we use it most often in our daily lives now. This phrase is definitely not intended to deny the sovereignty of God. Not only do we know that everything is under his wise providence and sovereign control, but the preacher has told us that several times, that he believes that. So we can't make these words say something that contradict what the preacher has already told us. So really the word time, it can refer either to the seasons of life. This is the way Luther took it in his commentary when he says it means every appointed time and outcome. Or it could simply be more specifically referring to an appointed time of divine judgment. In either case,
audio isn't working.
In either case, my audio is not working. Can you all, I guess, you nod your head if you can hear me? Okay, thank you. In either case, the time is the events of time, the things that come into our lives, and chance.
Somebody is speaking that you need to mute yourself.
Chance is not meant here to mean fate. Um, as we sometimes use the word, it's all just a matter of chance. But really, it's to refer to an occurrence, something that happens to us in life. We use that. We might use the phrase chance meeting. I had a chance meeting with Roy Lee yesterday. I don't mean that it was purely fate that brought us together. What I mean is we didn't plan to get together. We ran into each other at the grocery store or at some other place. Those of us who want to give it more of a Christian context, we say it was a divine appointment. But I think we understand that the word chance is often used that way simply to mean an unplanned occurrence. And that's really what the preacher is talking about here. And from what is said in verse 12, which is what we're going to get to next, where we see words like evil used a couple times, and then something suddenly falling upon someone else, we realize that the preacher is talking about bad things that happen. So we might say natural disasters, environmental catastrophes, military conflicts, economic downturns. I was thinking just what happened in Haiti just yesterday with this earthquake of over 7 that just destroyed so much of the area. Now they're faced with another natural disaster because in a few days that hurricane may roll through the area. And so these are unpredictable things. These are things that man really, in many respects, can't plan for. And that's really what the preacher is talking to. Those things happen to everybody that happens to live in that area. And it doesn't matter how talented you are or how gifted you are. You still might end up with having something like that occur in your life. And so really that leads him to the next verse, verse 12. For man does not know his time. That is the time of these occurrences, like fish that are taken in an evil net, and like birds that are caught in a snare. So the children of man are snared at an evil time when it suddenly falls upon them. So he's saying life is unpredictable. It's misfortunes that are inevitable. They're often inescapable. And he does this by giving 2 very vivid images from nature. One is the fish that's caught in the net, and the other is the bird who gets caught in a snare, in a trap. And we realize that if the fish and the birds knew that something was going to happen, they would have avoided it. They would have not gone near the fish would have not gone near the net if it had known what it was. And the birds would have avoided the snare if they had realized what would happen, but they didn't. And that's his point, is that just like the fish and the birds, man oftentimes
I don't know if it's for
is
this.
unaware. And so therefore, no matter how gifted we are, how well prepared we might be, or even the advantages that we have in life, we can't always guarantee that we won't suffer an evil day. So the question becomes then, what should we do? And so what the preacher does is, at this point now, he set the stage for his recommendation that we need wisdom. And he's going to defend that position, first of all, by giving us an example of someone who was wise, and then by comparing wisdom to less advantageous alternatives. But I think one of the main things we can say up front, because we know that the beginning of wisdom is the fear of God, is that yes, we need to plan for things. And the preacher is not at all ever saying that we need to go through life without planning, without being prepared. In fact, he's going to talk about that in one of his proverbs later on. But what he is saying is, no matter how much we prepare, we still need to trust God. We still need to rely on him. No preparation prepares us adequately for what might happen. The only one we can trust absolutely is our God. But the first thing then is the example. This is in verse 13. He says, I have also seen this example of wisdom under the sun, and it seemed great to me. So he is recalling, we believe, an actual event, an actual event that he saw or was aware of. And he calls it great. That is, in the sense that it's significant, or that it teaches an important lesson. He wants to use it because it fits perfectly with what he has to say about wisdom. So here's the story. He says, there was a little city with few men in it, and a great king came against it and besieged it, building great siege works against it. So for some reason, there's this little city. It has few men in it, which means that there are few to protect it. It's largely unprotected. And up against it comes this great army with this powerful king who has the ability to build these great siege works against the city, which probably had walls to protect it. But it looks like the city is overwhelmed. It's outnumbered, it's out maneuvered, it's the technology is on the side of the great and powerful king that's come against it. But in the midst of that, the preacher says, but there was found in it a poor wise man, excuse me, and he, by his wisdom, delivered the city. So again, most scholars believe this is a real historical event. In fact, many scholars have tried to identify it, which I think is interesting, especially based on what the preacher is going to say later on, in that no one remembered the man. So I don't know how it would ever get recorded or how we'd ever figure it out. But some have tried and probably have failed miserably. I don't really think that that's the point. In fact, the preacher doesn't even tell us how he did it. We're left going, well, where are the details? What was the wisdom that he used to get him out of this situation? And we're not told. We're just told that this man was poor and he was wise, and his wisdom actually saved the city. And that impressed the preacher to no end. And yet, no one remembered that poor man. So despite the good deed that he did, this poor man was not remembered by those he saved. And I thought, we could compare that with Joseph. You remember Joseph, in his wisdom, revealed the dream of the butler and then told the butler to remember him when he was restored to the king's favor. And of course, the butler forgot until later, when God brought it to his mind at I guess we could say, a more opportune time. But for the longest time, Joseph was forgotten in the prison because the butler just went about his duties. The other person that I thought of was Mordecai. You remember that part of the plot in the book of Esther is that Mordecai uncovers the plot against King Ahasuerus, or King Xerxes, depending on your Bible, and it's recorded in the king's annuals, but nothing is done for Mordecai. And so for the time being, that deed is forgotten. Later on, God brings it to the king's attention, and it's the turning point in the story. But nonetheless, for a time, it is forgotten. And so wisdom oftentimes is forgotten. Wisdom doesn't always make one famous, doesn't guarantee a fortune. And yet, what the preacher has found is wisdom is still very valuable, because wisdom can overcome incredible obstacles. In fact, in verse 16, he says, but I say that wisdom is better than might. And here that's the case. The might was on the side of the enemy, but wisdom prevailed. And he says, though the poor man's wisdom is despised and his words are not heard. So again, we don't know the situation, but we're led to believe, even from this last statement, that the people didn't appreciate the wise man particularly. Here he's said to be despised, and his words were not listened to. And yet at the same time, even then, his wisdom was able to overcome a very powerful enemy and save the city. So we see that wise people aren't always appreciated, and certainly their wisdom is often ignored. And yet at the same time, it's better to be wise than not wise. Now at this point, then, he's going to give us a couple of examples of what it's better to be And before we move on to other things, he says, the words of the wise heard in quiet are better than the shouting of a ruler among fools. And here the idea is that the wise man, the wise person, doesn't need to do a lot of shouting to get his point across, because his words really speak louder than anything else because of the wisdom that's there. They move people's hearts by their wisdom. Now, this doesn't contradict what he just said. People often do despise wisdom and they refuse to listen to it, but many people are moved by someone who gives a wise counsel or wise direction at a very needed time, and often do listen to them much more readily than a person who, I think the contrast is to a powerful person who's throwing his weight around, shouting down other people, but he's only surrounded by foolish people who are his yes people. And so the preacher says, the wise man doesn't speak loudly, doesn't shout to be heard. He just speaks wise words, and people do appreciate that. People do understand it. And in the long run, it can really accomplish some incredible things. So finally, he says, wisdom is better than weapons of war, but one sinner destroys much good. Again, we need to be careful what the preacher is indicating here. He is not denying that there is a time for war. That's not the point. Rather, what he's saying is wisdom is superior to weaponry. Again, we see from the example, that was the picture. The enemy of the city had great weapons, great army, but wisdom was superior to that, and can be. But again, then he sets the stage for one of the most important lessons he's going to teach any of us in this book by this next statement. He says, but one sinner destroys much good. So he recognizes that wisdom has its advantages. Wisdom can accomplish so much, but at the same time, it doesn't take much to spoil the good that wisdom might produce. And there can be a lot of damage done by just one. He says sinful person, but I think since the comparison throughout this this whole section is with the foolish person, that's really what he's talking about. Not just someone who sins, but someone who really doesn't fear God and lives a very foolish life. And I think it's especially his focus because here he's talking about these powerful people. He's saying especially someone who is in power, that's going to be true. Someone who is a fool, in fact, he's going to come out and say it, a fool that has great power really can cause much damage in and among the people that he leads. Now, I'm going to break it here for just a moment to see if you have any questions or comments, but I don't want you to see this being isolated from the very next verse because they go together. He's going to amplify on this, and that's where I really want us to focus on what it is that he is saying, because it is so important, and it's something that's almost at times counterintuitive to the way that we think things ought to work. But first, let me just stop and ask, is there anyone who'd like to make a comment or ask a question with regard to what we've looked at in the latter part of chapter 9?
Well, Doug, one thing that I was thinking about when I was talking about wisdom, and it's the quiet wisdom that is in contrast to the powerful or the noisy. And I think we see that in our society today. And I was listening to a sermon yesterday on Hebrews, and it was talking about our society today. We don't have a lot of wise people because of technology and television and stuff like that. The people are not thinking things through anymore. We're just grabbing a hold of thoughts and feelings and something that may sound good, and instead of people taking words and understanding what those words are actually saying. They're either agreeing or disagreeing with them. And I think that that is something that, we all should be praying for, that the Lord give us the wisdom of our day so that we understand and can pray for what it is his will and his purpose is. So that's my 2 cents worth.
Thank you very much. That's absolutely true. I told Paula the other day that if someone were to take this book and take it out of the Bible and take the name off of it and maybe not print all of it, but maybe take large excerpts from it and just put it out there on the internet, I think most people would read it and go, wow, this is really insightful. This is really wise. Where did this come from? It really does speak to today, and I think you're right. As I've read this, I've thought, it fits so perfectly. We are an almost mindless society, just reacting to one thing after another without thinking through the consequences of anything. And the decisions that are being made on almost a daily basis seem to be so foolish. You wonder where it's all going. But we're called to be wise. And so in the midst of all of this, that's what we're called to do as God's people, is to seek his wisdom and to live wisely in a world that acts very foolishly most of the time. So thank you for that. Anyone else? Okay, we'll move on to one of the most memorable proverbs that you'll find in Scripture. There are many that kind of catch you with their with the picture that it leaves you in your mind. And I think that's what makes a proverb really good, is if you can't forget the illustration that it gives us. And the preacher begins chapter 10 with, dead flies make the perfumer's ointment give off a stench. So what we want to see here, and I think this is critical to the example, is there's nothing wrong with the fragrance. There's nothing wrong with the perfumer's ointment itself. What has happened is that it has attracted a swarm of flies, and some of those flies have died in the perfume, and the stench of their carcasses has turned the perfume rancid. And that's the picture that the preacher wants you to have. This perfumer's ointment. I don't know if you've ever walked through, I used to have to walk through Nordstrom to get to the men's section. You had to walk through the perfume or ladies' fragrance section. There was no other way to get to the men's clothing section but to go through that way. And oh my goodness, all of the fragrances, there were so many of them, and they all were just floating in the air, kind of combining with each other. It was almost all you could do to hold your breath to get through before. And I'm not saying they weren't beautiful smells, but there were so many of them, it was just overwhelming. And so if you can picture this beautiful ointment and the smell that it should have given off, and now these dead flies have just ruined it. And then the preacher says, so it is, so a little folly outweighs wisdom and honor. And I just think about that. That's not the way it ought to be. A little folly should never outweigh wisdom and honor, but that's the way it works. What the preacher is saying is wisdom is like this sweet, fragrant perfume, but it doesn't take much foolishness to make it stink, to make it sour. In fact, Derek Kidner, I'm sorry, he has so many of these one-liners that just really stick with you. But I thought he, again, hit the nail on the head when he said, it is easier to make a stink than to create sweetness. And I thought about this example a lot. And I don't want to be misunderstood here, but I think that it fits this situation so completely that I'm going to bring it up. And that's what's happened to Ravi Zacharias. I think most of you know that after Ravi passed away, there was rumors of sexual misconduct, which were investigated by his own organization and shown to be correct, that he had numerous inappropriate sexual encounters with several of the women who were his massage therapists, and carried on extensive inappropriate relationships with many of them over the internet, and so on and so forth. And when all of that came out, I had more than one person at our church say to me, I will never read another or use another book that Ravi Zacharias has written ever again. And I don't want to lessen the severity of his sin, and I don't want to think that it is only a little foolishness, because it clearly is great foolishness. And yet at the same time, I think we need to understand what the preacher is saying here. Ravi Zacharias, while he was alive, ministered to millions of people, literally millions of people, helping them to better understand the scriptures, helping them to better understand false religion, helping them to better understand how they could minister to people caught in false religions, helping them to understand how they could present the gospel to people who were living foolishly. The man was incredibly wise with regard to so many things. And what we, I think, need to understand is that regardless of what he's done, the truth of what he said has not changed. Those are still wise things. Those are still valid things. Those are still helpful things. But those things have become stinky because of what he did. And that's what the preacher is saying, is we can live a life of honor to God. We can live a wise life most of our life, and we can do we can make one rash word, we can make one rude comment, one hasty decision, one foolish pleasure, one angry outburst, and we can destroy the whole thing. We can make our whole life stink. And I think it's something that we need to think about, because it shouldn't be that way. One's whole life shouldn't be made stinky by one mistake. And yet that's the way society works. That's the way the preacher society works. That's why he brings it up here. That's what we see happening in our own culture today. You make a mistake and you're done. And so we have to be wise, because the stink in Ravi Zacharias's case is the stink of the gospel. The gospel doesn't stink, but Ravi's behavior, at least for a time, has made it stink. And so what the preacher now does is he, using this as his jumping off point, and I hope you'll never forget this illustration, because I think it's beautiful in the sense that it reminds us of just how easy it is to make something beautiful stink. But now he's going to give us these short stories, case studies, proverbs, comparisons, exhortations, in comparing two ways to live, the wise way and the foolish way. And the question we have to ask ourselves as we go through this is, am I living wisely or am I living foolishly? And I say this because it isn't a all or none. We can be, just like the preacher said, we can live wisely and then all of a sudden live foolishly and destroy the wisdom that we have left behind. It just because we're Christians doesn't mean we can't live foolishly. We're going to look at the definition of a fool, and we're going to see that a Christian is not a fool in that sense of the word, but Christians can live foolishly from time to time, and they can do much damage to their testimony. And so we have to always ask this question, not just at the beginning. We can't say, well, I put my faith and trust in Jesus Christ, so I'm living wisely. No, we have to make sure we're living wisely by following the word of God faithfully and not doing foolish things. And that's why I believe that the preacher is helping us with these things that he's saying here toward the end of this book. So he begins, a wise man's heart inclines him to the right, but a fool's heart to the left. So again, what is a fool? I think we've talked about this before, but a lot of people think that a fool is simply an ignorant person, of someone who is stupid or of low intelligence, or what we might call a dunderhead. But that's not the definition that the Bible gives us. The Bible gives us the definition of a fool as one who lacks the proper fear of God. And therefore, he's prone to making wrong decisions because of it. He can be characterized by an impulsive disobedience, self-centered arrogance, a rash disregard for God's holiness. And that's why I say we can act like fools from time to time, even though our lives wouldn't be characterized that way. But sometimes we do things which, if we look at them in retrospect, yeah, that was that was a pretty much of a disregard for God's holiness when I did that. That's what sin is. Sin is a disregard for God's authority, disregard for God's reverence, disregard for God's holiness. When we sin, we're really thumbing our nose at God and saying, yeah, I know you saved me. Yeah, I know you're the ruler of this world, but I'm going to do things the way I want to. And so we're prone to that, and we need to be careful. Now, when it comes to right and left here, no disrespect for you left-handers, and I know I've got at least one in the audience, maybe more than one, but most people are right-handed. And so Scripture, like most literature, understands the right hand to be associated with strength, which saves, supports, protects. We see that all through Scripture. It's the right hand of the Lord that protects his people. It's the right hand of the Lord that uplifts them. It's the right hand of the Lord that overcomes their enemies. And then the right hand is also used for blessing. If we look at the Old Testament particularly, we saw that the blessings were conferred by placing the right hand upon the individual, and even Jacob reversing his hands, the hands that to bless Joseph's kids, because he knew that God was blessing not the one that was expected, and so he reversed his hands so that the right hand would convey the greater blessing. Also, the right hand is associated with authority. That's why it said that Jesus sits at the right hand of God the Father. It's not a picture of him sitting down in that way with God, but it's a recognition that Jesus has all authority. All authority has been given to him, and it's that sitting at the right hand of God that conveys that authority. And so when we talk about someone going to the left, we're talking about someone going in the wrong direction, someone who isn't on the right road. And the preacher says it's all because of man's heart. And I think we know that that's the way Scripture describes the heart. The heart is not just an organ that pumps blood. In Scripture, the heart is the core of the person. Everything in life follows the heart. Where the heart leans, that's where the person is going to go. And so we see here that wisdom and folly are inclinations of the heart. We're either inclined to wisdom or we're inclined to folly. And depending on the leaning of the heart, that's the direction that the life goes. And so we see here that the wise person leans in the direction of obedience to God. Doesn't mean that that person always obeys, but it means that that's the true leaning of the heart. That's the true direction of the life. But the fool is going in completely the opposite direction. And further, verse 3, even when the fool walks on the road, he lacks sense, and he says to everyone that he is a fool. So the fool is on the wrong road, completely wrong road, doesn't even realize it. I had a funny comment by Dan Alexander that I thought was really appropriate here. He says, quote, "The fool will follow a path that seems to be right, even when the blacktop gives way to gravel, and gravel to dirt, and dirt to rocks and debris. Almost nothing will stop the fool from plunging ahead into peril." So you see, the picture is, okay, blacktop seems to give the impression you're on the right road, but as you begin to get further and further from the main road, you would think that someone would stop and say, I think I've taken a wrong direction. but the fool doesn't do that. The fool doesn't even realize that he's wrong. Now, some have said here that really what's saying is the fool goes along calling other people foolish. And that certainly is a possibility of what's being said, but I think more likely, based on everything that the preacher has said so far, is that it's the fool who, by what he does, convinces others that he's a fool. In fact, Proverbs 13:16, which I gave you there, says, the fool flaunts his folly. So just the way he responds leads people to believe that he is foolish. Okay, so the preacher has now, I would say, defined foolishness. He's given us what it is and the effect of foolishness in our lives and what a fool looks like, and how we can even identify a fool. But now from verses 4 to 7, he gives us some practical advice for how to deal with foolish people that we meet in the world. And the first one is interesting. He's kind of raised the issue before a little bit when he talked about how wisdom is a calm response in the face of an angry leader who's out of control, yelling, shouting, making noise. Here he says, if the anger of the ruler rises against you, do not leave your place, for calmness will lay great offenses to rest. So if we can generalize that, again, which is what I'm trying to do, is take these proverbs and say, generally, what does that mean? Ordinarily, the best response to anger is to stay, not to run away, and to remain calm, not to get angry. And even though the preacher is really most specifically dealing with members of the royal court, that's who he has in mind here. He's talking about those who are in the presence of the king and have to deal with maybe a bad-tempered leader or ruler who gets angry. And he's saying that the affected official should stick to his post and speak words of gentle wisdom. But again, the principles can apply to almost anything in life. I think this is one of the more helpful principles. And one of the things that was brought to my attention just last night on the news was a situation of road rage. And it was the way that they introduced it was an officer standing beside a car on the side of the road with bullet holes in it. And the officer was asked what happened, and he said, well, it was a case of road rage where somebody felt that somebody had cut him off or something, and probably what happened was one of the people flipped the other one off, and so one of them pulls out a gun and starts firing. Now, no one was killed, but you could see numerous bullet holes in the car that was right next to the officer. And he was saying, don't do that. You know, that people get angry and do crazy things. You could lose your life just responding angrily to someone else's anger. And that's really, I think, what the preacher is saying here is don't do that. The best approach is to remain calm. And if you're in a situation where you're with someone else, it's better not to leave, but to stay, remain calm, and try to diffuse the anger and deal with the situation. That's the best approach. Again, Derek Kidner says, it is better to have only one angry person than to have two. And he's right. If you have only one angry person, you have some hope of the non-angry person calming down the other and being able to resolve the conflict. If you'd have two angry people, there's no hope of reconciling. They're just yelling and screaming at each other, and they're never going to apply the principles that will get to some kind of resolution. And so, again, staying calm is part of God's winning strategy for dealing with foolish anger. We need to see the wisdom of remaining calm and speaking wise words until one calms down. I know that was one of the hardest things that I had to do on the phone when I first started with the Internal Revenue Service is we got all kinds of people that called that were furious. And oftentimes you were met with a barrage of swear words were the first things out of their mouths. They were angry, they were abusive, and you had to say calmly, you can't talk to me that way, but I will help you if you will calm down. And the goal was to calm these people down so that you could figure out what it was that was the real issue and that you could begin to address that issue. But you had to remain calm. If you didn't remain calm, the contact was pointless. You weren't going to be able to help the person, and you certainly weren't going to do what you were given to do in that situation. So it was difficult. It was a very difficult thing to listen to anger and then work to restore calm. But I found, interestingly, the preacher was right. Most of the time, if you remained calm, you could eventually calm the person down and help them deal with their issue. So very pertinent advice. Verse 5, there is an evil that I have seen under the sun, as it were, an error proceeding from the ruler. That is, rulers often govern inappropriately, and errors in leadership often produce evil in society. If I have to give you an example of that, you haven't even looked at the news this week. Because I'm sorry, you know, all you have to do is turn it on or go on the internet. It's there. It's just, it's appalling. I have to say that I don't even understand it. I just feel like we, as a world, we've lost it. As Barbara just said, most of what we're doing doesn't make any sense at all, and it's causing horrible consequences. And so I put in Mark Twain. I don't know why. I've loved this comment, and it helps me to see that even in Mark Twain's day, this was still true. But the comment is: suppose you were an idiot, and suppose you were a member of Congress. But I repeat myself. I sometimes think that that's true. It shouldn't be true. We should be able to elect intelligent people to Congress that will do what's really best for this country. But it seems like once they get to Congress, they've forgotten what it is that they were there to do. But they're not the only ones. There's a lot more out there than that. But again, where the preacher is focusing here is different than he was before, because he's now really focusing on what happens when we have foolish people in power. All of a sudden, the foolishness is amplified. If you or I act foolishly, it doesn't necessarily affect an entire city or county or state or even nation. But when someone else who's higher up acts foolishly, it can affect an awful lot of people. And so he goes on to say, folly is set in many high places. That is, fools do get elected to high positions or appointed to high positions, and the rich sit in a low place. So to set the stage for the next example or two, he's basically saying when wrong people get into power, not contradicting the fact that God has placed them there. God is still sovereign over putting people in places of authority. But he says when those people are fools, God has a reason for that. But when they're fools, everything gets turned upside down. Now, with regard to the comment, the rich sit in a low place. When we just read that, apart from the context, we'd say, well, I don't see anything wrong with that. The rich are often need to be lowered in their place. They need to be brought down a notch or two, and maybe that's a good thing. But that, in the context of what he's saying, that is not what's being talked about, because he's talking about things being out of order. When fools govern, then things don't work the way they should. So here, the rich person is the person with financial resources. And what he's saying is those people don't have the power to use them for public good. When there's fools in office, financial resources get ruined, destroyed, wasted. And certainly an example of that would be all of the aid that goes to foreign countries to help people in disasters or catastrophes or whatever, oftentimes those governments take the very supplies that are sent for goodwill and use them for their own benefit, don't use them for the people that need them, or charge the people an exorbitant price to have the stuff or whatever. And we can see, there's just countless examples of that as well. And that's really what the preacher is talking about, is that fools in high places oftentimes upset the things that God has put in place to help the poor. And then he goes on, I have seen slaves on horses and princes walking on the ground like slaves. Again, another example of what happens when folly is in leadership. In biblical times, horses were strongly associated with power, wealth, royal authority. Slaves almost never rode horses. They walked the horses, and oftentimes they walked beside the horses, even leading the horses as their masters rode. But at best, they either walked beside or in front or behind the horse, but never were they on the horse. So we see again, things not working the way that they would normally work. And I thought at this point, Philip Graham Ryken, in his commentary, I thought gave some really wise comment. This is a quote. He says, as a Bible teacher, it is not my place to say which political leaders are wise and which are foolish. Sometimes this is unnecessary anyway, because as the preacher has said, the fool lets everyone know that he is a fool. But whenever we see things turned upside down, whenever a society celebrates immorality, perpetuates wrongful violence, punishes righteousness, denies the authority of God, or persecutes his people, we may be sure that folly is in control. And I thought that was very wise to see that. Now, how do we know when a person is a fool? It's when a person isn't following the commands of God, isn't following the word of God, isn't fulfilling his or her position the way God intended them to when he put them in that position. He then changes just slightly at this point. All of those, I think, were related to leadership. Now he brings it down to a characteristic of the fool, I believe, and then a couple of really good examples of wisdom. The first one, he who digs a pit will fall into it, and a serpent will bite him who breaks through a wall. He who quarries stones is hurt by them, and he who splits logs is endangered by them. So I listed this as folly is self-destructive. Now there are some, and I'm going to read you the commentary of one such person, believes that all Solomon is saying here is that we need to be careful. The world is not a safe place, and if we are wise, we'll watch out for danger. Tremper Longman is one such person, and here's how he put it in his commentary. Here, an innocent person is simply engaged in his occupation, and he is accidentally injured. This is the first of 4 illustrations of people who are simply doing their jobs and who fall prey to the dangers that are inherent in their occupations. Their injuries are simply accidental. They are not punishments for bad behavior, and they are not mentioned so that the wise person can avoid them. They are unavoidable accidents. Now, with all due respect for Tremper, I think that misses the point of what the preacher is saying. And I'm always going to come back to context. We can pull these proverbs out of context and make them say a lot of things. And certainly what Tremper Longman has to say is valid. We do need to be careful. There's a lot of ways we can hurt ourselves. And if we're not thinking through those things, we can get hurt. I can think of many times when I was not really careful with how I handled a ladder, and almost impaled myself a couple times on things that were on the ground as I fell. So yes, you have to think through what you're doing and what some of the potential dangers might be. But here, where we're comparing wisdom and folly, I think he is probably talking about the foolish or even evil man who, in this first part of the illustration, falls into his own pit. Certainly that was the case in Psalm 7, verses 15 and 16, where the evil man prepares a pit for someone else and then falls into his own pit. And we might say similarly, the man who knocks down the wall is probably one who is knocking down a boundary marker and gets injured because he was never meant to be doing that in the first place. And I think the large majority of commentators would agree here that what we're really talking about is, for every folly, there's the possibility for self-destruction. That's the way folly works. Folly is dangerous because it can so easily not only destroy a reputation, as we saw before, but can actually lead to other serious consequences as well. And every time we go into folly, there's this possibility that that's where we're headed. I think Charles Bridges said it very clearly when he said, quote, "Evil shall fall upon the heads of its own authors." I think that's in keeping with what the preacher is giving to us here. Be careful, because foolishness can lead to self-destruction. Then he says, if the iron is blunt and one does not sharpen the edge, he must use more strength, but wisdom helps one to succeed. That is, we can overcome obstacles to effective work by being properly prepared with the wisdom or skills that are needed to accomplish the task. If we're wise, we're going to take the time to properly prepare, in this case, the blade. If you've ever tried to cut something with a dull blade, you know that all you're doing is hacking it to death. You're not actually accomplishing anything, and even if you were, it doesn't look very good when you're done. But even a simple thing like cutting up boxes, I've noticed that if my blade isn't sharp on the little utility knife that I use, I can't cut through it, and it ends up ripping and tearing, and I waste a lot of time. And so again, the preacher is saying, when God calls us to a task, we need to make sure we have the right tools to do that task, but we also need to make sure that we're prepared to use them well. A lot of times our temptation is going to be to rush into things, not take the time to prepare. And unfortunately, wisdom is going to be thrown out the window when we do that. And we're going to have a much more difficult time doing the task if we can do it at all. And so we need to remember, not only do we have to have the right tools, and of course, God gives us the tools that he wants us to have to accomplish the work that he's called us to, but at the same time, we need to prepare. A lot of times, just simply having the skill doesn't mean that we'll perform the task well if we haven't prepared for it. So on the one hand, we need to prepare. Now, verse 11, I think, is the very opposite point of verse 10. Sometimes there's danger in acting too slowly. So he says, if the serpent bites before it is charmed, there is no advantage to the charmer. This is a tough one because I don't really know if serpents can be charmed. I did some research to see, and it appears that, you know, there's very little evidence that you can truly charm a snake. And that most of these charmers actually go to great lengths to make sure that the serpent isn't going to kill them if it isn't charmed completely. So they, you know, they sew the mouths of these serpents mostly shut, just enough so the tongue can stick out. They make them fairly anemic, so they can't really respond too quickly. And most of the time, they've taken out the poison, so they really aren't poisonous. But assuming that snakes can be charmed, the idea here is that once a snake is charmed, it can be kept under control. But before that, it's very dangerous. It can bite, and if not protected. Most of the snakes that were charmed, even today, are dangerous snakes. They're deadly snakes. They can kill if they bite. And so the idea is that, and pardon the pun, I couldn't help it, foolish delay will come back to bite you. But taken together, I think it shows why we need the wisdom from God. Sometimes it's important to take the time to prepare. If we're not prepared, we're not going to do well. On the other hand, sometimes we need to act quickly, because if we delay, it's going to be too late. And I was reminded as I was thinking about this that we have the same proverbs in the English language. One of them is, and I think we've talked about them before, he who hesitates is lost. Sometimes you've got to make a decision quickly. You can't wait. If you wait, you're going to miss out, or you're going to cause something to happen adversely. On the other hand, what's the other one? Look before you leap. Yes, thank you. If we do things too hastily, there can be a negative outcome as well. Now, both of those things can't be true at the same time, but what we really need is the wisdom to know when to use which proverb. And that's what I think the preacher is saying here. Both of these things are true, but both of these things aren't true at the same time. We need to know which one is true in the moment when we need the wisdom. And so we need to ask God for it. For wisdom will help us to know the difference and when to apply one or the other.